Hello, I'm Ricky Egge, and welcome to Tufin's webinar on Segmentation Simplified. So we get into design and deployment from ground to cloud. So this is part two in our three-part series. So part one was kind of getting started, building the plan, etc. Part two is going to focus on some of the things that you identify and how to clean those up. And then part three, we actually get into, at the end, hybrid and how we can actually integrate with the CI/CD pipeline. So what we're going to focus on today, design and deployment, ground to cloud. So again, Ricky Egge from Tufin here, Director of Solutions Engineering. I'm going to get into why we do what we're doing here at Tufin. Number one, reducing the risk to your crown jewels, actually being able to identify what's important in your infrastructure and working to protect that infrastructure. Creating more secure paths through the network. So what you want to do is be able to make sure that you can pin up a path from point A to point B that adheres to your policies and ensures that you're not allowing extra things through on those policies. We're looking at low and no code ways to integrate and work faster. So tying in things like vulnerability scanning tools with APIs so you can measure exploitability based on your firewall rules and your vulnerabilities, and things like ITSM tools, et cetera. And then at the end of the day, ensuring auditability so that instead of doing all these manual things with spreadsheets and reviews, you're able to generate a report to see from a compliance perspective, how am I adhering to this, both internal compliance and external compliance like PCI and NERC-CIP, et cetera. And why are we doing this presentation? Because hybrid security makes our jobs harder, right? So as we're moving post-COVID into more IoT, a lot of companies are moving to or adopting a cloud-first strategy. And we've seen a huge push for this here over the last few years. And this is creating more complex and fragmented networks, and the attack surface for us is growing. And it's very easy to create publicly accessible infrastructure out there in this cloud environments, and we want to protect against that out there. And so what are we seeing is we're seeing a lot more firewalls go out, NSGs, ASGs, the providers' native firewalls that they have, like Azure Firewall, AWS Firewall, et cetera. And one of the biggest challenges in this is there isn't an effective and comprehensive way to manage all of this in a single spot, right? Azure Firewall manages Azure, Palo Alto Panorama manages Palo Alto, and there's really not something that gives you that clear map from A to B how your security policies apply, and that's why Tufin exists and what we focus on to try to make your lives easier. So segmentation simplified, what we're going to look at today is rapid identification and prioritization of violations of your policy, right? We're going to look at automating design and implementation for those changes. We're going to look at automating policy into design for continuous compliance. And this is actually going forward for new access and what if. And then we're going to look at new visibility and automation enhancements that are actually going to help you out as you move into a hybrid environment and moving into the public cloud. So rapid prioritization and of an identification of violation. So this is basically looking at what's my risk and where should I be spending my efforts. So in part one, we talked about classifying your assets. In part two, we're going to talk about using that classification, right? Use those zones that you defined, use those policies that you've started to set up, and focus on your important things first, right? What's creating the most risk to your environment? What's the most critical assets in your environment? And focus on those first. We're going to look at, do you understand what's needed for this asset again, right? So if you have a clear understanding or if you of what's needed, you don't have to necessarily ask this question, but if you didn't build that as part of the foundation in part one, then you're going to have to come back and understand that and talk to the owner of the asset, understand what's needed, what does it need to talk to, who should be able to talk to it, right? And then look at the prioritization as well from our vulnerabilities associated. So as we look at risky reports and protocols, we also want to look at the vulnerability information and understand, is this asset accessible and is it vulnerable? And if it's those two things, that means it's exploitable. And we want to identify those and remediate those. We look at some options from mitigation. So can I use firewall rules to help with this asset? Do I need to decommission the asset altogether and turn it off? Or do I have to, should I patch the asset? And I hope everybody's going, yes, please patch the asset. Number three is taking action with workflows, right? So we're going to look at a few workflows: rule modification, network object decommission, group modification, rule decommission, and how you can use these to automate some of those day-to-day jobs that you're doing that you would have done manually in the firewalls in the past. So what you're seeing on this screen is actually using those that asset classification. So as you built those zones out, you built those USPs out, you're actually able to measure them in a couple of different ways. So on the left, you see taking kind of the USP form of it. So you're actually able to say, all right, based on my rule properties or my risky services, et cetera, here's all the rules that violate. Or on the right, you're able to take a by device based approach, right? And then in either one of these, as you drill in, you can get into the individual rule. And on that individual rule, you can actually get in and see the security violation. So on the bottom of the screen, you'll see that I have a PCI DSS violation in here from my data to my web tier. It's a violation. The service I have is HTTPS. The security requirement was allow only TCP 9043, which falls outside of my corporate standard that I've defined for PCI. So that means I have to kind of clean that up. So that's when we get into like identifying it. We've built these dashboards for you. We have reports that you can leverage for these types of things. But this is where you actually start to get in and identify where you're outside the policy. And in a demo that I'm going to do a little bit here at the end, I'll actually show the vulnerability mitigation and what that looks like as well. So when we look at remediation options, right, we want to understand, right, can I just remove a service like Telnet or FTP? Maybe I have multiple in the rule and I just need to do that. Just need to get rid of one of those services. Do I need to, maybe I need a time constrained exception in here. So if, policies are nothing without exceptions to them. And then does the rule provide other access that's necessary? So there's one of the big questions, right? If it's providing this access, is it actually business critical? Is it providing it for other teams that we don't know about? You would kind of want to look at that as well. And can I drop it into a group and block its access until it's patched? Maybe I just need to pull, it's one of like 8 web servers, and I need to pull one offline while we patch it and the other 7 carry the load. We can do that. There's workflows for that. And then, or do I just remove the specific rules that expose that vulnerability? So maybe it's got a rule for SCP, and it's got a rule for HTTPS, and it's got a rule for RDP. And the rule for HTTPS is the one we need to look out for. There's an Apache struts vulnerability. We're just going to remove that. It's got Apache running, but there's nobody using it, so we can just turn that off. The rest of the server can function. We look at decommissioning the asset, right? Is this system needed at all? There's plenty of times where stuff just doesn't get turned off and it sits and runs in perpetuity, just creating holes in your infrastructure. It's a great opportunity to find those, identify those, and get rid of those holes. Can I or have I migrated this workload to another system? This is one where, as I said, people are moving their infrastructures to the cloud environments. This is a great opportunity for you to understand, maybe I should move this system first and rebuild it and get everything kind of updated on it, make sure it's ready to go, and turn the old vulnerable system off, or the one that's got extra access, turn it off and get it back down to the core of what it's for and used for. And then, or would it make sense to rebuild it from scratch too, right? So maybe I just rebuild it as take the old physical server and rebuild it as a VM, or just spin the one VM up and spin the other one down and replace it. There's options like that. And then patching the asset. And I wish this wasn't the case, right? But let's be real here. A lot of us wouldn't have jobs if we didn't have problems actually patching and having these violations in our infrastructure. And then the big question, can we even patch the system? One of the things out there is, why haven't we been patching the system? And one of them is, dang, it's Windows XP. I wish that this wasn't the case, but there's a lot of manufacturing systems, a lot of healthcare systems that are running old software and old operating systems. And the reason that's the case is because it costs millions of dollars to buy the upgraded hardware with just to get an OS upgrade. Spending $4 million, $5 million on a new MRI machine is not trivial for somebody to spend just so that you go from Windows XP to Windows 10 or something like that. So there's reasons why we don't patch and why we have to use other mitigating controls for access. So when we talk about identifying what you want to do, now we can actually take some action with some workflows in here. So we look at a few of the workflows that Tufin has for assisting in this. Group modification, where I can add or remove items from groups that exist out there in the firewalls and permit or remove access by using those groups. We look at network object decommission. Where does this exist, and remove all of its access? Rule modification, where maybe I want to add a source or a destination or a service, or remove one of those 3. And then rule decommission, where this is just not used, or it's not relevant for my infrastructure, or it's bad violation, we're going to get rid of it. So there's those workflows that allow you to do those things. And as we look at these, the group and rule modifications, the group modification is pretty straightforward. It allows you to add or remove objects to a group. Where this is used is, typically you'll have 3 rules at the top of the firewall. Rule number 1 says administrators or management systems to this group are a permit, and it allows things for like patching and remediation, investigation. Rule number 2 says anything else to this group is a block. And rule number 3 is this group to anything else is a block. And what that does is it allows you to just remediate and manage that system, remove its access while you get everything fixed. Once it's done, you can remove it from that group and it returns that service, that object back to service. So that's the group modification. The other good use case of this is actually in like incident response. Like I've detected a malicious IP internally or externally, and I want to use this workflow for that as well. Then the rule modification workflow is similar, except it's focused on a rule level basis. So I want to maybe SMTP and SMTPS are outside of my standard, like you'll see in the bottom right here. I'm going to remove those two services from this rule. Everything else is acceptable. So I'm going to just remove those two services, push that out into production, and then call it a day because now I'm within my corporate policy. We couple other workflows, the rule decommission and the network object decommission. So we'll start with the network object decommission at the top, and you'll see it's actually decommissioning an old lab subnet. So this is where you have the opportunity to put in an IP address, a range, a subnet, and actually go through and do an impact analysis, see everywhere that this subnet or IP is used, to design the change, remove everything, and then to do a verification that it was successful. And then the rule decommission workflow, very straightforward as well. I've identified this rule that's no longer relevant or necessary, and I'm going to remove it from service. And you have the ability to disable it. Maybe you disable it for 30 days or 60 days, and then 60 days later, you look for rules that have been modified and haven't been modified for 60 days, have been disabled for 60 days, and you go ahead and just run a workflow again, and you delete those out. So nobody's needed them in 2 months, they're gone. And then, of course, you see the designer and verifier and stuff in that workflow as well. Now we're actually going to stop the share here. We'll actually get into a deep dive demo, and this will give us an opportunity to kind of see the suite itself and see what it looks like as we go through it. So I will go ahead and share my screen here. So what you're going to see is, in this case, this is Google, Google Chrome, but this is Tufin's secure track portion of the suite here. So we can actually see the overview, and what I talked about and showed you the screenshot there earlier of the compliance trends. We actually measure that over time as well. So you can see over time how you've been doing from that compliance perspective. And then you're actually able to see the rules with violations. So you'll see I have it sorted by device now. I can sort it by USP. I can select which criticality I want based on each device, et cetera. And then I can drill in. So as we get into the USP here, for a few things I want to cover, just as kind of a housekeeping, if this is your first time, so is the zone definition. So this is where you're going to want to leverage the no code or low code ways to house this information. Tufin shouldn't be your source of truth for what your zones are. We should consume that information from another system, like an IPAM, ideally, where when you assign an IP address, you're assigning a zone to a system in there, and you're able to actually see this is what this system is supposed to be used for. So this is where you actually have all of that information. We'll display it, but we should be pulling it in via API from that other system. So that goes into that low code or no code way to integrate other data. From there, we build the USP, and this is again, I talk about starting small in here a lot of times. And what that looks like is actually this big matrix, and this is a complex one. But if we look at data center to R&D, I have the option to say there should be no traffic, there should be allow all traffic, or customize, and you can build an allow list or you can build a block list. So in this case, I would say block HTTP, SSH, TCP 110. You can put other guidelines around it like explicit source, destination, and service. So this is basically disallowing any as in those 3 fields. You're enforcing comments and logging, etc. But you want to start, start small. Start with the risky services only. Maybe then build a USP that has the rule properties, and then get started in other areas of the infrastructure. So once we get that information, that all comes back into the dashboard, and that's where we actually have the ability to drill in and start to use some of the workflows themselves. So I'm going to actually just drill in on this ASA. We should probably just decommission the ASA anyways and move to a something newer like an FTD or one of the other next gen firewalls that are out there. But what you're going to see in here is you'll actually see the overview, network group 37 to network group 38, SSH. We can actually click in, see the violations. And this is where you'll actually see from PCI data to PCI web. My security requirement says I should block these services. SSH is in this list. It's a critical violation of my policy to allow SSH from here to here. Now I can actually take this and make a decision on what I want to do with this. I can actually go through and recertify this rule. This gives me an opportunity, if I don't know if it's still necessary, recertification can allow me to send this back to the business owner, Mr. Mrs. Business Owner, is this server still, or this rule still necessary for your app? They may come back and say yes, at which point then you have another decision. Do I create an exception for this rule for a period of time until they can move to a new technology or remove the need for that access? Do I modify the rule? Maybe we have a different port and protocol they can use that would be acceptable, so I add or remove that. Do I decommission the rule, right? Maybe they come back and say, yeah, it's not necessary, and I'm able to actually decommission the rule and remove it from production. So this is where we can start to leverage the information and start to make decisions. So this is that rule, kind of that visibility of the security policies. The zones that you create also tie into something else, and that's vulnerability mitigation. So what this does is it allows me to take that zone-based view in here, and I'm going to say, look at Toronto. And in Toronto, I have these servers with violations. I can actually see the different rules. I can see what zones I'm a part of, which enforcement points, which rules permit access to violations. But, and somebody's already mitigating that one, so we'll find a different one. So this one you'll see is a little different, and you can actually go through, and this is where we go to the asset access decommission. And this is that network asset decommission workflow that I mentioned, that we saw the screenshot of. It automatically sends it to this, or mitigate via group mitigation. So you have two options there. You can actually turn its access off altogether with the asset decommission, or you can use that group modification, like I said, and give only administrators access to it. Once they patch the system or remediate the system, you can remove it from the group and it returns back to service. So this is kind of some options and decisions you can make on individual pieces of infrastructure. So this is why I say start with what's critical first, because you're going to go through and it's going to give you a lot of information, and you're going to want to focus on the things that are important first, as opposed to maybe some of the low-hanging fruit, right? But it also gets you away from saying, I'm going to patch all critical vulnerabilities. Well, if only one person has access to a critical vulnerability and it's 6 layers deep in your firewalls, it's probably a low value add to fix. Now, if something is, critical vulnerability, it's a critical piece of your infrastructure, running your flagship application, and it's internet accessible, you want to focus on that first. And this allows you to rapidly identify and see, is it accessible? Is, what tier is it a part of, right? So it's really helping you to understand where you should focus your efforts. So that's where we look at kind of that, using those workflows in those different scenarios. Once we get through that kind of this reactionary portion of cleaning up everything, we actually get over into secure change. And the secure change is where those workflows are housed. But the one we're going to focus on today is actually the access request workflow, and how you can actually build in that segmentation policy that you've built and leverage it going forward. So in your normal day-to-day, right, source, destination, service, this is what your users submit. Ideally, we ingest this via API from an ITSM, like a ServiceNow or a Remedy or a Jira or something like that. And they fill it out there, and they're just populated into Tufin. That business approval probably happens there as well. But then we get into what Tufin does, and this is where we go suggest target. So suggest target, what that's going to do is use that topology map and all of the router switches, firewall connectivity, and it's going to go through and it's going to build the list of, hey, this is the path that something takes through my infrastructure. So, from source to destination, it goes through these different FortiGate firewalls, these different routers and switches in here, and you can actually see that it's getting dropped in several places. You can see it's allowed in Azure. So this is where we talk about hybrid, and you'll see I'm not talking about on-prem, I'm not talking about specific firewalls. We actually have the cloud environments in here as well. And we actually get much deeper into that in part 3. But this is taking that topology map and it's building that list of devices that are impacted by this change. We're going to actually go through and we're going to run a risk analysis step as well. So what the risk analysis step does is it compares that source destination service to the USPs, and it compares it to all USPs. So it's going to go through and say, from this source to this destination, this is what applies. So if we go back to that scenario where we looked at the data, we looked at the data center in here, and we looked at talking to R&D. So if we look at this cell, it says allow HTTPS, SSH, TCP 110. So if we actually make a request and it's one of those 3 ports and protocols, it's going to go and say, all right, this is within my policy, which is great, right? It means I'm requesting something that would be standard usage in there. We take that information, including vulnerability scanning information in that step as well, and we actually can present that then to the end users. So you'll see the little risk button here. It will be red if there's a vulnerability or if there's a violation of your policy. And it will be green if there are no vulnerabilities and there are no violations of your policy. So what that means is it gives you kind of a quick visual representation of what does this change look like from a risk perspective, taking into account your normal policy, your standards, and the vulnerability and patching information of that system. Once that's done, you'll have the ability to approve or reject the change based on this. And then we get into things like technical design and implementation, where we're actually going to design the change, push the change out. And then at the end of the day, we have the auto verification. So this is going to wait for secure track to get the change compared to what was asked for in secure change, merge those two together. And if everything is cohesive, it matches, we'll actually go ahead and turn the verification button green. So taking this a step further, we're actually going to look through a task in here, and we'll look at an access request for Palo Alto and AWS. So when we came into step 1, you'll see that they requested the source, destination, and service, went through the business approval here in step 2, and somebody actually approved that. We get to step 3, and it did the target suggestion, identified targets and risks here. So it built the list of router 5, Palo Alto firewall, the AWS data center 2 in here, and it turned the risk button red. We get to the risk review, and we can actually take a look at this. As we drill in, we'll actually see that, hey, you know, my policy standards, the Australian government here says anything from my user networks to my unassociated networks is a block. I shouldn't be allowing them. For clarification, unassociated networks are the networks that don't have any zone associated with them. So our unassociated networks are all private IP addresses that aren't in another zone. So if you haven't created a zone and there's somebody stands up a new subnet, it'll fall into unassociated until you tag it appropriately in there. But you'll see all the different policy violations. So I have Australian, I have SAFRA 1 and 2 in here as well. So you're actually able to see these different zones. And the subnet, in this case, this is in 2 different zones. It's in Texas VPN users and in my corporate zone. So there's multiple zones that a subnet could be a part of from that standards perspective. So that's why I encourage you to use a tool like an IPAM to manage that information. From there, we go through the approval and we actually get into the design of this change. So if we, you'll see the designer button is not green or anything here, it's gray. So we're gonna go ahead and run the design. And what this is gonna do is it's gonna actually calculate the changes. We'll select the AWS security group that this is a part of. So you can see that this is a hybrid change, right? It's looking at my data center, it's looking at a router, and it's looking at AWS as well. And as it goes through, this is a smaller deployment. It'll calculate this change pretty quickly. And it's going to come back and actually tell me what needs to change. So I can actually look at the rule here and see it's going to add just Borislav's test, that subnet with TCP 6500. I can actually look at the existing policy in here as well and see that it's got all kinds of other stuff in here. So HTTPS, it's got the SSH in here, things like this. So it's got all of those things in here. We can actually look at the access request and the related rules. So if I look at that access request, it's highlighting what's providing the access in here already based on the request. The request was SSH, TCP 6500, and YouTube. So you'll see SSH, HTTPS, and HTTP, which are YouTube uses both. So that's what it's identifying what already exists and what it needs to add. So that's where it only does that. And then you'll see for the Palo Alto, it's got all kinds of stuff. It's adding new subnet objects, it's adding the comments, it's adding everything in there. And if we want to look at view AR and related rules, it'll actually show us that, hey, in this case, it's only showing the rules that are related for the AWS that already exists. There's no other rules that exist. So that's why it's showing all new stuff for Palo Alto. And then at the end of the day, of course, if we go back here, rule 6 is going to be the design and commit, and rule 7 is the verification. So these steps haven't taken place yet. So it's a demo ticket we haven't deployed, but that's what it looks like as you step through end to end. And again, that vulnerability information can come in there. So I'm going to actually kind of go ahead and pause here, and we're going to go back. We're going to talk a little bit about what's coming in 23.1, which is getting released here very, very soon. And we'll jump back in and share that slide real quick. So now that we're done with demo time, we're going to get in and look at what's coming in 23.1. This should be out here within the next week or two. So we're looking at a couple of things. Cisco Meraki supports, you're actually able to view all of the things that are existing in Cisco Meraki. So this is, and I'm going to remind everybody, this is already available in release candidates. So if you do want to test it out in the lab, feel free. GA is going to be here very soon. And then checkpoint FQDN automation. What this does is this allows you to take, instead of using IP addresses, as you're moving to the cloud, everybody's moving to host names. And it allows you to take those host names and actually leverage those as destinations in there instead of the IPs, which are really ephemeral. We actually upgraded the topology map quite a bit. So what you'll actually see is that in the topology map, you're able to actually group objects together, and it stays and keeps that custom layout that you've built. And then some other topology and automation enhancements, right? AWS Gateway Load Balancer. So this is a feature parity thing with Azure. So now with Gateway Load Balancer, you're actually able to have an accurate topology of how your firewalls, if you deploy like a Palo or a Checkpoint or a Fortinet into AWS or Azure, accurately model how traffic flows through those in that topology map. Added in things like Azure Shared Express Route, Azure application security groups, et cetera. So there's a lot that's kind of being done. If you have any questions, you want to see any of these things, absolutely reach out to our sales teams. Here, they'll actually go through, they can do a roadmap with you, walk through the demo, understand how you're using the current suite, et cetera, and then help you tie those features together and understand what's actually going to be important to you and to your team to be successful. All right, so kind of finish up with a couple of questions. First one that we get is, how do we get started? And the answer is always start small, right? Start with that risky services, start with the best practices. But then let's say you're past that phase, you have those. Now what do I move to? This is where you move to a couple of things. One, the remediation that we talked about in this presentation of cleaning things up, but also look at opportunities to be able to tighten the security policy as proactively. Am I migrating an application from one data center to another? Do I have a segmentation project running in this manufacturing location? We're putting firewalls in. Use those as opportunities to build those custom security policies for those environments, right? You don't have to build one big one. You can build multiple small ones to achieve your goals. And multiple small ones are ways to get this done without trying to boil the ocean and without it being an insurmountable task. So we really recommend kind of getting started small. And then the last question here was how do we integrate this with CI/CD? And that's actually a great question, and that's actually tying into our next presentation. So we talk about hybrid and being able to do this on-prem in the data center, tying your CI/CD pipelines in, and actually, like, a lot of Terraform, a lot of our clients use like Terraform from HashiCorp, or they're using CloudFormation templates. How do I build those security groups in those areas and check them to see if they fit the policies prior to going live in production? And we'll actually talk about that here in our next presentation that's coming up in June. So we'll have segmentation simplified with that focus and that deeper dive into the cloud environments and areas. So I hope this has been informative. I look forward to talking and seeing you all in the future, and have a great day.